All right, so welcome to the Patriot podcast. Today's guest is Brad Owen. He was an aviator in the Navy for over 10 years. After the Navy, has had an extensive business career in the aerospace and defense world. And he's here today to talk to us about his military career, his business career, and how he has bridged that gap, transitioned from one to the other, and just continue to push hard today. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Would love to kind of dive into that. How did your Navy career, your military career, shape and influence your business career? Like what does that transition look like, and what lessons did you take that you applied into the business world?
There's quite a few. Unfortunately, you think about it as not being that transitional. There's a lot of people, they get ready to leave the military and they feel very insecure because they don't know what exactly they're going to be able to do and what's going to transfer over and all that kind of stuff. Most business in general is learning how to do. They take basic skills that people understand what to do and then apply them to whatever their specific application is. So, for instance, when I left the military, first off, I went right to a New York-based insurance company that specialized in aviation insurance, and it was all about how do you insure things that people in the general insurance world don't want to insure. And the reason for that is if you think about actuaries and putting together numbers and trying to crunch numbers and come up with actuarial tables and say people get to pay whatever they have to do based on this, it's based on lots of data, lots of data points, so they can do that. With aviation, there are so few airplanes in the world, it just doesn't have that same type of situation. So, risks get very, shall we say, upside down very quickly depending on how you price them. So it's the insurance term is peaky. So you get lots of, 9/11 was a great example, a great peak, for example, in what happens. The last, major experience with something like that was probably the Boeing grounding, where they had all those airplanes stuck on 737s, unable to fly. Exactly. So, in those types of situations, businesses insure themselves against this because, they don't want to take that type of loss they can't necessarily manage themselves. So in business, you'll see a lot of people that will go through and they talk about how do you manage risk? And it's a big issue. It became a big issue around, right around 9/11, around the first time when the dot-com crash happened, because there were a lot of, businesses that found that they were exposed to a lot of things that they probably shouldn't have been. And upper management didn't know that, what was going on at the lower levels and how big the trades that some of these people had put together actually got them into trouble for what it happened to be. A lot of things in the insurance world at that point in time, they were talking about, some very sophisticated and very, esoteric little risks that got, insurance companies way upside down very quickly trying to insure against financial risk. They didn't know what, for the most part, they didn't recognize the value or the volume of the risk they were undertaking. And so when all of a sudden something like, a catastrophe like 9/11 happens, all of a sudden things get very bad very quickly. And it's billions with a B losses that happen right as soon afterwards, which is, not expected when you're only taking in a few $1 million in premium and then have to pay out 1,000 times more of that when you're, paying claims. So, but yeah, a lot of what we learned this time was, number one, trying to quantify risk for people. So, being in the Navy and flying gave you a little bit more perspective on what an aircraft does and what these things are related to. My specific area was related to manufacturing and, how these different pieces put together, quantified risk for a manufacturer, and manufacturers who would do things and not understanding what they were doing or why they were doing it. Someone would come to them with a project they needed to have done, and they wouldn't think twice of whether it was on an automobile or on a tractor or on a tank or on a missile or on on an aircraft. And all of those obviously are very different types of risk when it comes to, insuring that type of thing. And the reason being, what's the end result? What's going to happen at the end of the day when something goes wrong? And that's really, putting those things together and sort of putting them in a reasonable network, so people can understand, what that meant was really helpful. So.
And post that insurance company, what other what lessons did you learn in the military that kind of shaped, like as a leader, how did that influence you?
Sure. So one of the biggest issues, sort of in business in general, the military has been, and the government, well, not necessarily government, I say the military has slowly been adopting a few more of these ideas, which is, when you think of lean business systems and how do you operate your organization in such a way so that You are listening, and really what it comes down to, and the big example of lean, and I learned this through, going through classwork at the end of my time at the insurance company and trying to modify and improve our business system so that you could run the business better. So therefore, you're not spending lots of money on what we refer to as frictional costs. So you take away all the frictional costs, and so therefore, what you're able to, charge, an insurance buyer wants to spend as little money usually as they can. So the question is, how do you have a company that can operate on such a situation where they don't have to spend a lot of money on the infrastructure of the business in order to get the same results for what they need? Translate that into any other company as you move forward, it becomes a similar type of situation. So how do you find a way to say, hey, I want to be able to run the business. These are my goals. How do I get there? And it becomes listening to the end user of what it happens to be. The military adopted this much later, but they've started taking this approach and saying, hey, if we listen to the people who are actually flying the airplanes and operating the boats and tanks and all that kind of stuff, ask them what's really important to them, and then sort of figure out the system backwards, it works a whole lot better. So I think that, as we went through with a lot of those, you found a bunch of different the little points that you could look at and say, okay, what's really important to this person at the end of the day? What is it that we need to be able to do to make sure this works all the time? It's resulted most recently with a lot of things. So as I went into, work for an aerospace parts company, you got to the same thing. The question was, we made parts for, all sorts of airplanes, military planes, and, commercial aircraft. And it was a big deal to have airplanes, available for what it happens to be. Manufacturers and operators in general don't like to have lots of excess of anything sitting around, because it's not doing anything, right? But that's what, in general, you have that. You have, spare parts or whatever they happen to be available for people to then work on stuff. And what they started to recognize a little later on was these spare parts don't necessarily have to be in your location, but they have to be readily available from somewhere else. And so the question is, how do they move this forward and continue to do this? And aircraft are pretty easy because they have a much more stringent, replacement schedule. Parts go for a certain period of time, then they have to be changed out, and they, certain number of hours, change all these parts, put new parts on, just so you don't have a failure, because failures are a bad deal when you're in an airplane up in the air, right? What they're recognizing now in the Navy is that there are, same thing with ships, is you want to be able to have ships at sea, not necessarily in port awaiting repair. Same concept. It's not as dire a situation, shall I say, because the things they're looking for, if the, whatever it happens to be fails, it doesn't mean the ship is inoperable. It just means that you have, different types of things you have to deal with at the end. But, certain systems may not work the way you want it to, for instance. So what they're moving to now is, how do we increase our, basically what they refer to as, they can refer to as battle spares, they can refer to as other things, but they have them available to say, hey, I need this shipped. I know the ship's going to be in port on this date. Please ship it there so it's available to be installed on that date, as opposed to, I'm showing up in port, they look at something and go, that's broken. Now I got to take it off the ship. Now I got to ship it to someone else. They got to fix it, or they can kind of come aboard the ship and fix it and be on their way. So they're starting to recognize this whole, though a spare is sometimes more expensive, in the aircraft world, it was always an important aspect, which was the more important aspect is operation of the aircraft, right? So if the airplane can continue to operate, it gains revenue, or in the military, it's readiness, right? So it's a different type of way of looking at it, is readiness increases by the fact that I have a spare available, even though it may cost a little more to have that spare in what it happens to be. And the question is, where's that balance point for the cost benefit analysis when you look at something like that, businesses look at it much more specifically in that area. Government's starting to get to that point where they're recognizing that I have a lot of assets that are not going anywhere. What is that doing for me? And, the other aspects of it, when you look at a lot of these things is, and this was one of the biggest issues that happened when I was in the military and getting ready to transition out. It was the end of the Cold War, the 90s. Everyone loved each other, supposedly. That was the general feeling in the world, was that, there aren't going to be any more wars. Everything's going to be great. Everyone stopped spending on their military, blah, blah, blah. And 9/11 changed a little bit, and then a lot changed more in, 2014, and more recently with Russia. And so it's become a whole different situation of how do you, and changing those dynamics is not a quick process. It's not like you can just all of a sudden go, hey, I'm going to just decide I'm going to go buy 27 more of those from Amazon. It's like they aren't available on Amazon, right? So building that infrastructure and the industrial base to be able to get back to that posture is a very difficult and long process. And it has to be a commitment more so than just a, one time, hey, I think we're going to do this and we're going to make it that way. And so as you move forward with these things, you start to recognize what business is trying to do more of now is find those ways that they can provide solutions to the government that are more business focused than government focused. And in that way, you look at they start to look longer term over periods of time and say, hey, you want this to achieve over a certain period of time, here's what you have to do in order to get there. But you have to commit to it, and it's not usually quite so much of a commitment all at once. It's not I'm not saying I'm going to have an extra aircraft carrier available all of a sudden, because those things don't just materialize. But it's how do you put the pieces in place so that when I start building an aircraft carrier, it comes together a whole lot quicker. Right. It's not taking me 4 years to put it together. It's taking me 2.
Supply chain optimization.
Exactly. A lot of that along the way. A lot of how do we make sure that we're bringing things together in a more reasonable fashion, and how do we replace them when they don't work? At the same time, so that they're not sitting around waiting for something to happen.
Moving back in your chronologically, when you were growing up, was the military always the plan?
Surprisingly, no. When I started out, my father, was, a child of he went through World War II as a kid, was, fortunate enough, and, depending on where it was, he was between both wars. So he wasn't old enough to go to Korea, was too old to go to Vietnam, and, his kids were born for the most part. And so there weren't really, situations where he would have been involved. However, my one grandfather was a engineer, worked at Chrysler and made Jeeps, back during World War II, and my mother got to ride around in the hills of, outside Detroit, testing, open, air Jeeps or whatever they, at the time, the old ones you see on all the movies. And it was, quite funny stories. Major aside, when I told my mother I wanted to have a Jeep when I graduated from college, and this was going to be my car, and she immediately went to this World War II Jeep with no doors and no top. And I said, "That's Mom, I gotta show you a few more pictures so you know what you're actually looking at." Whether it's changed a little bit over the years, it still was very, very utilitarian and wonderful, vehicle to have. But it was just so funny how her concept was still from, 45 years earlier, right, when she was a child. So my grandfather, my father grew up on a farm, in Illinois. My grandfather and his brothers all owned a farm. One of them was in the military, served under Patton in World War II, and so it was one of those situations. But reading, he sent, obviously, we were talking earlier about chronicling things that would happen. He sent a bunch of letters home, and my father's sister, now my father's cousin, has chronicled all these things and put them in a book, basically, along the way. So they have this whole list of, here is how he went through Italy and Germany and everything else along the way. And, it's funny how you read these letters, and it's so, I guess it's surprising that things haven't changed in 50 years. The answer is everyone's still complaining about the food. They're still complaining about leadership. They're still complaining about, what do we really think we know what we're doing? That kind of stuff. Why are we here? What's happening? All that kind of thing. So, these aren't new concepts as they go through it, but it's probably, for everyone that's younger thinking about being in the military and how this is sort of like, do they really know what's happening? It's like, it's still going on the same time. For years, this has been the same type of situation. So, I went to high school not really knowing what I wanted to do. I was going to do something. I like science and math. And, airplanes had always been something I was interested in, but it wasn't really something that took off and showed, here's what it is and here's why it's important. A cheesy answer to this whole story is went through and, watched Top Gun when I was, coming out of high school, and everyone went, I think that's really would be a great application of all these things. They're sort of all coalescing together around what it could possibly be. So, I didn't have great eyes, so I ended up being a naval flight officer sitting in the back. But, goose was just as important as everyone else was at the time, even though, when you get in the aviation community, there are lots of people make fun of, what does a Rio in the backseat of an F-14 do? And there was lots of jokes about it, but there are jokes about every airplane and pilots around the way. So
Nice. So what age did you join?
I joined ROTC coming out of high school. So I started at school and joined ROTC my freshman year.
Okay. And why Navy? Just because of Top Gun?
No, it was two aspects. One was, grown up loving the water, even though I was from Illinois and Lake Michigan was close by. So it was, something that we always were enamored with. But, the one thing we always looked at and said, well, there's this wonderful thing called the medical exam you have to get through, and who knows what's going to happen between now and then. And if you don't pass your medical and you're in the Air Force, what do you do? At that point in time, you were sitting in a missile silo under South Dakota or Missouri or Montana or wherever it happened to be, which, though a very important position, wasn't something that was really exciting to me at the time. Yeah. So, what the other aspect was, you'd be on a ship at sea doing something else. So that was sort of where, and one thing about being in the Navy is no matter where you are, you always end up on a ship at sea at some point in time. Yeah. Hopefully you're doing something you really like, which is a good thing. So that's the important part.
So take us through military career a little bit. What was your experience like going through initial training? Any deployments? Highlights of that career? Take me kind of through that chronologically.
Sure. So you started out when you went, like everybody, you go through flight school down in Pensacola, Florida. Everyone starts, flight school in Pensacola. I was fortunate enough to spend, 2 years there, which, great place to be for 2 years when you don't have anything really else to do, which is nice. Learned how to fly 3 different types of airplane, T-34, T-2, T-39s. And it was in each of those varied depending on what the aspects of training were as you went through and different things. So T-34 was basically, this is an airplane, this is how it works, that type of situation. This is what you do with it, basic navigation and all those types of things. You got to T-39s, it was same concept, just faster. So here's what you're doing at a much faster pace. And it was the reason they used the T-39 was because it was a fuel optimization type of situation. So instead of only being able to have one student at a time, you could have 2 or 3 students at the same time, on multiple missions going out in a course of a day without having to do maintenance on the aircraft. T2 was, basically really just to get you experience with what this is military flying. This is, yanking and banking, turn and burn, that whole type of thing. A lot of air combat maneuvering, a lot of low-level training, trying to figure out how you get from point A to point B, and just to experience the, when you look and watch, something like Top Gun and you get to see the way the airplanes move around, this is exactly where you train with in an airplane that isn't quite so unforgiving if you don't do it right, when you start out. So
from that, like by that point, how long had you been flying planes? Like, you came into the Navy with zero flying experience?
Zero flying experience.
So how long does it take to get to the point where you're doing like combat maneuvers?
So it was probably, it was longer for us only because it was right at the very end of the Cold War. So they just started, so the big drawdown happened, and I graduated from college in 92. Big drawdown started in 91-ish, 92, it really accelerated. And so they were trying to figure out what do they do with all these people they had prepared for, a force that was probably 2 times the size that it was when the time I got out, they wanted when they got out. So it was a lot of delay in between various, situations. So it took a little longer to get through, but in general, flight school now, the way that the Navy trains it, there should be no more than 2 years from initial start to finish for a pilot. So if you think about it that way, they're doing, they go through the first, usually takes about 6 months for the most part for basic, flying. Here's what an airplane is, all the classroom work and everything else to get you familiar with it, get you in the simulator, get you in the airplane and actually do a bunch of flying. The next parts are a little faster because it's just more repetition of the same thing over and over. And it's not mastery of the skill, but it's more familiarization to a point where they think you are competent and able to achieve it. And then the last parts are, obviously there's still, it's similar aspects of it, but the majority of the end of training, at least for pilots, is focused on landing aboard the carrier because that's, a very important part. It's becoming less so now with the technology as they move technology along. They've decided there's different ways. Magic Carpet is a great example of what this is, which is basically it's the it's their version of the, it's like an autopilot and an ILS for the most part, if you're familiar with civilian aircraft. So, the autopilot flies the glide slope to the deck. In years past, the technology wasn't quite there enough, as though you can do it in an airliner without any problem because the airport doesn't move. When you're on a carrier, it's a different story because the ship moves and it can be in a range of different directions. And so as a result, it was just harder to get the airplane to actually follow the glide slope. You can follow the glide slope, but the question is, like every landing, it doesn't really matter what the landing looks like until you get right next to the ground, right? So, at that point in time is where they had to sort of figure out it was the speed of calculation, I think, is really what it got down to.
What was it like when you first, I've seen videos of it all the time. It has that little slingshot that I guess it hooks onto when you land. What was it like when you first landed, on an aircraft carrier for the first time? I can't imagine how that must feel.
It's probably the weirdest feeling you've ever. You think about it, and you're like, "Oh, you're going to stop very quickly," and you think about stopping quickly, and this is like 20 times more quickly than you would have thought it would be. So you're going from 150 knots to 0 in about 400 feet. Is basically what happens. So, it was a funny story when I left the Navy and I came out and I was talking with a guy, I was interviewing in New York, and, this guy waited around behind to talk, and he's like, he said, "I have to ask you this question." He says, "I have a Ferrari. I can do 0 to 60 in, 4.5 seconds." He said, "You got to tell me what it's like to accelerate an airplane on a catapult." And I said, "You're not going to like this." And he said, "All right, well, hit me anyway." And I said, "All right." So I said, "You're going 0 to 150 knots in about 3 seconds.
Oh my gosh.
So he was like, "Oh," so for someone who's used to, you're used to the acceleration of a car, and that's, it's still a great acceleration for most parts. Getting slung off the end of an aircraft carrier and coming back, on the backside, those are two experiences.
It's got to be just
you really can't compare to anything else.
Yeah, adrenaline rush.
So.
Have you ever ridden on Rock and Roller Coaster in Disney? Does it feel anything like that?
I have
okay.
not.
That's the only thing I can think remotely.
I've done the Velociraptor one at Universal.
Yeah, where it just launches you.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I could think of would be a remotely similar feeling of just being stationary and just launch. Your face goes back, and
it is a lot of shall we say, violence. In that whole thing, it's a very violent maneuver for the most part. It's not, even though it's, managed, there's still, you can't stop the initial I guess something you probably don't know, and most people don't, is so when they, you see all the stuff in the movies when they get everybody hooked up on the carrier and away they go. So they put the engines up and they're sitting there and they're sitting on the brakes. And then what happens is the pilot releases the brakes and basically, wipes out the controls and basically says, "I'm ready to go." So there is at this point in time a piece of steel that's probably about 2 inches around on each end and has a little bowl, a little smaller diameter in the middle, that's used to hold the plane to the catapult for the most part on the ship. And it's called a holdback, basically. And this thing when the steam power is applied to this thing actually physically shears, and the airplane goes flying. So this bolt of metal is basically what holds you to the ship as you're sitting there at full power waiting for everything to go. And then when the catapult fires, this piece of metal just shatters, and away it goes.
That's crazy.
So, yeah,
that's awesome.
But that's how they manage that whole
fear of not getting enough lift quickly.
All the time.
I gotta imagine.
All the time.
So have you heard any stories of that going bad?
It happens every so often. It's not very common. In most cases, it is, one of two aspects. There's, sometimes the catapult is set at the wrong weight setting for whatever reason. So in other words, don't have enough, steam pressure behind it. So it accelerates, but not enough, and you don't get to flying speed. And the other is that there's some failure of something along the way. So in most cases, it's funny, the catapult is strong enough, basically, and the airplane has got enough power behind it that there have been people that have inadvertently left the parking brake on while they're on the catapult, and it's basically just blown the tires as it thrusts you off the aircraft carrier. But you still go fly. The problem is it's really hard to land once you come back without any tires. So
I read I think it was called Endurance by I was gonna say it's either Scott Kelly or Mark Kelly. I'm blanking on his name. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The astronaut?
Yes, yeah. He was also a pilot, and
Yes.
he was documenting some of that, someone taking off and landing on aircraft carriers, and um, he explained well, one, the difficulties of landing and catching that, but I was also going to ask you, there's a story where he was out doing a training operation and was very low on fuel and like barely made it back, and then missed the landing not missed the land, but like couldn't catch the landing a few times,
Right.
and was concerned he was going to just run out of gas and dive into the ocean. Has that anything along those lines happened to you, or have you heard anything like that?
Every so often you get in those situations. The weather's bad. It's difficult. The pilot's having a bad day. Newer pilots sometimes have that issue. Even I guess sometimes it happens to older pilots too when they're having a bad day, whatever it happens to be. For us, once we got to the point where we were off the coast of Southern California, and depending on where the ship is in relationship to where San Diego is, like, is really what it happens to be. And for whatever reason, we were doing ops and we were further away than we would have liked to have been, which just increases your, the amount of fuel you have to carry when you get to that certain point that they call bingo, which basically, when you get to that point, and then the question is, you're going to take the airplane and you want to get aboard, you want to get to shore safely because you don't want to lose the airplane in the ocean, right? So when you're in a situation like that, you always have that option. When you're blue water, meaning there's no port nearby, this is the type of situation where you're right. There is that you have a lot more tries at it because there's no other place you're going, because all you're doing is just going to go off the end and just move a little further over to the right so they can pick you up when the plane goes into the water, right? So not an ideal situation, certainly not something you want to ever plan for. And they'll try and get you aboard as much as they can along the way. And there's obviously levels of, number one, you want to come back with a perfect landing. Number two, you come back a little less. So, there's other ones where they'll come back and just to get the plane aboard the ship, because at least you get to use most of the plane, whereas you put it in the water and chances you're going to get it back are pretty slim. So, it depends on what, where they are in that, matrix of things along the way. But if it doesn't happen, it's so infrequent, it doesn't happen very often and especially now there was a much more common situation. You see the movies and you listen to all the old tapes from World War II, and they're watching all these newsreels, and their planes going off the side all the time, right? I mean, it's just the way that aviation was back then. It was a very basic airframe, a very basic instrumentation, and oh, by the way, they were getting shot at all the time, so things weren't always working the right way when they came back. So when you get flash forward now, all the sophisticated things they have on the airplane to bring you home, the computer flies the airplane for the most part. I mean, most pilots, as much as they worked a lot harder, they don't want to admit the fact that it's a whole lot easier, but it's a whole lot nicer, especially at night in bad weather when you come home and there have been numerous times you come back, you're flying down, and they're like, oh yeah, everything's great. And even when it wasn't rough weather, like we were, one of my deployments was our Westpac was mostly spent in the Persian Gulf, but the Persian Gulf has crappy weather. It's foggy and it's nasty and it's nice up in the air, and then you come down to land and you're flying through clouds until you get down, and it's foggy all the way till you get to 300 feet, right? And coming down the chute, knowing you're watching the instruments and you're on the glide path. And we did this once, probably about 8 months prior to that. And they were testing the ship. The ship had just come out of maintenance, and they were testing certifying the landing system. And they came down the thing, and here we are out of the clouds, and the ship's over here, and we're over here.
Oh no!
So it's like, okay, well, this is and you could, because it was daylight and it wasn't a big deal, you could correct and come back and do the approach, and then, but it's the kind of situation where if that's to your other one where you're hoping that you're in the right spot, but you can't see anything, and then and even when they're on the ground, they can see you to a point, and the paddles can see you better from the ground than you can see them, just because you're a big light flashing at them, as opposed to you trying to find a dark spot that's not lit up on purpose so that it doesn't affect your night vision when you're trying to bring the plane aboard. So but yeah, making sure the systems work is a big deal, and these new systems they've come up with are really helpful. And flash forward to what they're trying to put it together with unmanned aircraft aboard the ship. They had when recently they had the tests, which is probably, not that recent anymore. It's probably 10 years ago now, when Northrop was testing the UCAV. And, they're, one of the comments that they got back, we were listening to a presentation from, Wes, what was his name? Campbell? I can't remember who the CEO was at the time, but he was relaying information that they had heard back from the ship, which was, can you sort of put a little variation in the software? Like, what are you talking about? He goes, well, you keep coming back and you land in the exact same spot and you're wearing out the lounge skid on the carrier deck. It's like, you need to vary just a little bit around that, within a few feet, not always within the same 6 inches. Right. So, but it was funny how the precision of the, electronics is getting so much better as they move forward and the computing power gets better, that it just makes it that much easier. It's recognizing in that small little bit of control, that changes, and pilots talk about all the time, the difference, the amount of moving, as you move the control stick and the throttle is so small, because every one you happen to do is one's a change, and then ones have to get it back to where you want it to be. So the question is, how much the more you move it the one way, the more you have to come back the second way if you're going to combat. If you overcompensate, I guess the best way of putting it. So depending on how that works and what it is, whereas, computers are a little bit better in that situation. They just somehow they're able the logic is a little bit faster, and they're able to just move those tiny things in the right spot. So yeah. Makes for perfect landings, which is nice.
So you spent a lot of time on the Prowler, no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I would love to hear a little bit about those. It seemed like a novel, unique thing. I was looking into them a little bit beforehand, and what is electronic warfare, and what does that look like? How do they operate? What kind of missions are they doing?
Sure. So if you think about electronic warfare, which is an interesting aspect of, when you go through, how do you accomplish what it is you want to accomplish, when it comes to a military objective? In most situations in a strike mission, you're trying to, in some way, shape, or form, either allow destroy the target so it's not usable again, or, render it unusable for whatever it happens to be, for whatever it is, whatever purpose. The electronic warfare mission of the Prowler came out of, in Vietnam, when they were trying to figure out how do you defeat air-to-air missiles, or ground-to-air missiles in particular. So, the answer was, I had a ground radar that was going to find the airplane and then shoot it down before it was able to achieve its mission, which was dropping a bomb on whatever it happened to be. So they started out with a relatively simple system, when you think about it today, because, electronics back in the 60s were pretty rudimentary, relatively speaking. Anything you could fit on an airplane was extremely rudimentary, because, computers at that time were the size of a room. A reasonable size computer was the size of a room, right? So, as you started to, the computing power increased and things got better, it became a different story, but it was all with the same intention of, how do I make the missile not be able to hit the airplane, is really what it comes down to. And, in a lot of those situations, the answer is, how do I disrupt either A, can it find me or not? Or B, can I just make it so that the guidance system on the missiles doesn't work very well? Older missiles were controlled from the ground. They didn't have things in the actual missile itself. Newer missiles these days, all the be the same thing for the same purpose of computers got smaller and all that stuff. So now all the guidance for the most part is in the missile itself along the way in a lot of these. Sometimes they receive cueing from the ground to give it information as to where it heads, but the actual seeking and the homing usually ends up being within the missile itself. There are certain aspects of, heat-seeking missiles, electronic warfare doesn't do anything with, right? Because it's not looking at the same type of situation. But, electronic warfare basically is, if you think about the electromagnetic spectrum, which includes everything from visual light to, X-rays, basically, all those radio frequencies in between is sort of what they try to exploit in some way or shape or form. So trying to find out what frequency the radar, either the search radar or the acquisition radar or the homing radar is working on, is the important aspect of, what electronic warfare becomes. A lot of research and surveillance done beforehand to try and figure out what those things are. Then the work at the end is trying to figure out which, and this is We worked a lot with Johns Hopkins because they had a lot of, some very smart people at the applied physics lab who said, hey, we can figure a lot of this stuff out and how these things work. But it's all about how do you, manipulate electrons, put them into the atmosphere in a similar area to where this radar is operating so that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to.
So you're disrupting the electronics of said enemy for the purpose of other airplanes and aircraft to be able to get through?
In general, yes, that's exactly what it is. Depending on the aircraft, right? So there's some like B-52s will carry their own, jamming equipment aboard the aircraft, and they are very interesting. If you listen to the stories from some of the pilots when they try and, they'll see a B-52, like fighter planes back in the old days, would try and lock onto a B-52, and they have some kind of defensive radar that basically will, back at when you had a big dish basically in the front of your aircraft as a tracking radar, say an F4 or an F-14, they could physically hear the radar being slammed to the side, by the electronic force that was coming out of the B-52. It was that big. But I mean, the B-52 is a pretty darn big airplane, so it's got the ability to carry lots of, generators and things to make enough electricity to do that type of stuff. So, yeah. Smaller airplanes, because they put smaller ones on lots of other, fighter aircraft for the same purpose, but it's designed to be close in, try to put some kind of frequency out that sort of disrupts the seeker so that it doesn't, blow up on you, and a little further away mainly, hopefully, so you can maneuver to the side. But
did you get to choose the aircraft that you like? Did you get to say, hey, I want to fly the Prowler, or were they kind of just like, this is what we're going to do, we're going to put you in this?
The Navy has a lovely process when they go through when you go through flight school, and they like to make you think you have a choice. They let you put down your numbers and what it happens to be, but at the end of the day, the answer is what they want,
whatever they put
and
you
what
in.
they need. Yeah,
okay,
it's really the needs.
I always wondered that, like, how do certain pilots get into specific planes? And yeah, that's interesting.
It depends. Go ahead.
You put your list of like what you prefer, but they just kind of still do their own thing.
It used to be, it's funny. They used to go through it, and it was they did I think it was right after I went through flight school when they came out, and they basically did an analysis of all the information they had, which was, again, you have to do back to the, how do you make sure you get the right thing, and actually using more business related, concepts for what they're doing when it came to training was, but they would go through and say, before it was just, here's, you put down your list, and, you had your list, and the Navy had their needs. And the answer was, if you were the first or the second person in your class, you got your choice, and everyone else just got whatever the Navy wanted. Right. And then they started to go through and looked at it and said, but, when you get down in those other numbers, the answers are, they probably aren't that much different. Like if you want to put, number 3 through 10 in one airplane and 10 through 20 in a different airplane, you could probably do that. Or obviously they mix them up. They don't do them all for one.
Yeah, you don't want all the best people on one plane.
Well, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, depending on the airframe, right? So, I mean, different airplanes have different, ways of operating and different types of things. And so, the answer is, do you always want the best pilot in the best airplane? It's like, probably not, because then they end up with a lesser pilot in a more difficult to fly airplane. So you ended up with a lot of, the Prowler was a unique airframe in that design, and the Tomcat was another one. Both ended up flying less time obviously in the 2000s than the Hornets did, and for good reason. The Hornet was a more sophisticated aircraft. It was a little better engineered. It was newer. It had lots more money behind it. All those types of things. Even though there are lots of arguments from lots of people saying my airplane was better, I did all sorts of stuff. It's like, yes, but it's just hard to maintain an older airframe for whatever reason it happens to be. Tomcat was very hard because the wingspan was very wide. He had a very wide wingspan, so therefore when you came aboard the ship, you really had to be on the center. You couldn't be off very much because you would hit something for the most part. Hornet's much smaller wingspan, so therefore you could be off center a little bit more in case things were. So, in terms of fighters, better pilots flew Hornet. The ones who were really, obviously top of their class wanted to fly Hornets because they knew that was the future. But other guys wanted to fly Tomcats because it was, as they referred to, the coolest airplane that was ever built. And so, they would go through and figure out what they could do, but sometimes you needed people with a little better skills, and people who were better landing aboard the carrier usually ended up with Tomcats or Prowlers for that reason. And Prowlers were weird in that way because the airplane was so big and heavy, they had to fly at a higher angle of attack coming aboard the ship. And so and that was just basically to slow it down, so they didn't have as much energy when you hit the wire, so you didn't wear out the wire. But they couldn't do that. If you were flying at the optimal angle of attack, you come aboard much faster, much easier to fly at that angle of attack. But it was the physics of the carrier and how it all worked.
Hope you guys are enjoying the show so far. Really quickly, we want to give a brief shout out to our sponsor for the show, which is, of course, Patriot Hard Seltzer. Patriot Hard Seltzer is a whiskey-based hard seltzer with a mission to give back to those who support this country. The veterans, the first responders, the nurses, these groups are so important in this country. And that's why we set out to create this brand. We wanted to create a great tasting product, which we have achieved. Whiskey-based hard seltzer tastes amazing. Everyone who tries it loves it. And then, of course, we have the philanthropic side where we give back to these groups and we support them, we honor them on the cans. We're just very excited to be able to get this brand out there to you guys. So if you are interested in learning more about Patriot, visit patriotseltzer.com. On our website, you can learn about the brand, the mission, the philanthropies. So that's the sponsor for the show. Now let's get back to it.
So what was it like living on the carrier? Like, were you out there for months on end, or was it more of like just you're out there for a few weeks and then you go back to the land?
Depended on the period of time. So when you were doing what we refer to as workups, you were a few weeks, up to, sometimes it was up to like a month and a half. Sometimes we would come back in that month and a half period. You come back for a few days and go back while the ship, replenished or got some other piece of equipment or whatever it happened to be. But when you went on cruise, the answer was, was everybody got up and off you went, and away you were gone for 6 months. So. But it was, it was definitely an experience, as some people refer to it. It's, it's tight quarters. It's not as tight quarters as a submarine, so you definitely have a little bit more space. You make carriers a fairly big, it's a very large ship. It's not going to be, for everyone who's been on a cruise ship, it's not that, tight type of situation where you have that. It's usually, in most situations, it's 4 people to a room. It's pretty much bunk beds, and, you get a little locker and a little sink, and pretty much that's where you are for the most part. That's your room. You spend time in the ready room, or you spend time, if you're, ship's company, you're in your workspace or whatever it happens to be, wherever that is. So, when you got down to the enlisted ranks, they were 4 or 5, big bunk rooms, just like you would think of in a, think of if you go to, any type of movie you've seen of people, living in a barracks. Similar concept, except the ceilings are much lower and everyone's all packed together, and the barracks and the bunks are about, 12 inches apart for the most part. So you're pretty much living very close to all your friends.
How are people working out? Is it like, do you guys have weight rooms and stuff? That people
There are
running on the deck?
Well, I mean, you can run on the deck when they're not doing flight ops. It's challenging, I guess the best way of putting it, because it's still a work area. So, they're doing maintenance on airplanes and all the other kind of stuff. So even though you can be running around, it's usually you're running around a lot of other stuff. It's not like they have a track set up that's, free of debris and, things you can run all the time. They had a few treadmills, scattered throughout the various decks. I mean, in various locations, depending on where they happen to be. You had, at certain ones, I had a friend, our intelligence officer, was a marathon. He was trying to run the Seattle Marathon, right after we got back from cruise, which was, we got back in October, and the marathon, I think, was in November or late October, excuse me. And so he was training all while we were on cruise, but, he did his whole training on a treadmill. So, a little different than most people for the most part, but yeah. But he got it. So, and depending on where you were, the ones in the front of the ship obviously moved more with the ocean. The ones in the middle of the ship didn't move quite as much, and so it depended on whether you got the ones that were oriented to the side, front, back, or or port and starboard. So it all depended.
So how much flying? Because I mean, you've seen people doing like repetitions all the time where you live. How much flying do you normally do in a week? Is it like you're going out every day, or are you like required to hit certain quotas to keep up with, your what do they call it? Like your flight awareness, I guess. Like how do they tell you guys, hey, it's Monday, go out and get some reps in landing and flying around?
A lot of it was based on schedule. So if the ship was you were going to the ship, you had to have there's a certain very prescribed number of landings you had to do before you went out to the ship, for the most part, when it came to carrier qualification. Hours in general were, it depended on where in the budget cycle you were, where in the deployment cycle you were, as to how much money you had for what it happened to be. So, in general, it used to be, you'd fly 300 to 400 hours a year easily, depending on what it was, which usually translated to, a flight every 2 to 3 days for the most part, usually every other day, if most part. And usually most flights for us were 2 hours, 2.5 hours, depending on where we were. On the ship, they were shorter just because the carrier adhered to a cycle, an hour and a half cycle time. And then it came down to an hour and a quarter, with the Hornet, because it didn't have enough gas to. The early model Hornets had a smaller gas tank, and so they had to bring them back. Sooner, otherwise you had a bunch of them floating around in the ocean. So it wasn't a good thing.
Was there any world in which you would have entertained helicopters, or is that like from the beginning? Were you on the plane, the fixed wing?
Because I didn't have the eyesight to be a pilot, I was sort of restricted to, helicopters were always 2 pilots.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So they're and then an air crew member who, operates whatever it happens to be in the back. But yes, all the helicopters are really the only aircraft. Like the Hornets were the same way. The early model Hornets were all single seat in the Navy.
Is that training, some of that shared training, or is it very early on you're separate?
Very beginning. And primary flight training is all the same for everyone. Everyone flies, T-34s now, T-6s, I think they are. But that's, same, type of situation where I need to know you understand how to fly, what aerodynamics are, how to fly an airplane, right? Once you move to helicopters and intermediate intermediate, I guess that's true. Intermediate still was in an airplane for my roommates when I was in flight school, and then the advanced was all within the helicopter itself.
Just kind of looking back, what things stand out to you with your military career? Like people, places, events. What's like some of those prominent things that you remember fondly when you look back?
So we didn't really get into it because I digressed too much, but I got to the squadron in early, probably mid-95. We weren't scheduled to go anywhere. They just come off a cruise in April. I got there in June. They were scheduled to start workups again the following February, March. So it was supposed to be a fairly, benign period of what happened and everything else. By Labor Day, we were told we were going to, Italy, because Bosnia was heating up and it was going to be a situation where they needed lots of other airplanes there. We weren't with the ship. It was just the squadron that went alone. We had another squadron that had a similar situation. There was an East Coast squadron. We were a West Coast squadron, or West Coast, I should say. The carrier I was on was West Coast based. There was an East Coast based carrier. All the Prowlers were based out of Whidbey Island. So they went over first for, 6 to 8 weeks, and then we followed them for a future 8 weeks after that, at the end of November, December. It was a very, for being my first deployment anywhere, it was quite an interesting situation to be, right in there in northern Italy and, watching a whole bunch of stuff on the outside. And it was, let's put it this way, that was my first trip to Europe. I'd never been to Europe before. So it was interesting wandering around, little tiny Italian, towns and, seeing the people there and everything else that was going on, and, taking off and flying out over the Adriatic. And then all of a sudden you were over Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it was a situation where, it was a little different than most. And that what we saw was, one of the things we thought was interesting was, though we were slowly getting involved from, probably the middle of 95 on, this war had been going on for, 3-4 years, unbeknownst to most of the world until, all of a sudden things got really bad. And, it was lots of, pictures on cover of Time magazine of, prison camps and that kind of stuff, which, gets a lot of people unhappy about what happens. And so, but it was a very interesting experience. We flew right over Sarajevo, and it was very quiet, very dark, very, not much happening there. And, one of the things they told us, that we were there was, oh, by the way, that wonderful stadium you see down there that they used for the Olympics, 10 years ago, whatever, is now being used as morgue. So it was that, these types of things that became eye-opening as you went through, that they're, this is what it is. This is the way life is in some places, and we're there for a certain reason, and we have to make sure it all works out. We were there in, Aviano right before the First Army, group got sent over there. I don't remember what the division was or the regiment was. I say not the First Army, it was the First Army troops that were actually sent to Bosnia to help with the peacekeeping effort back in the day. But yeah, there was some hardcore bad feelings that had been there for 50 some years under Tito. Like people didn't like each other. Like they really didn't like each other to the point of, sectarian violence, what same thing that happened in Iraq in the early 2000s. It's there, it's everywhere when people get unhappy with something that happened years ago and somebody's ancestors did something else to somebody else's ancestors and they're still holding these grudges, and moving forward with that. And then a lot of times the other aspect of it is they're there because, there's monetary gain to be had by controlling the territory for whatever it happens to be, natural resources or, warm water ports or whatever it happens to be. That's the issue of the day as to why I need to invade another country. But, for me, it was interesting to see this, firsthand, and here's what it is, and here's how you, sort of go about it and what you have to do differently. And then it's all the other aspects of you never know when that person down there is going to shoot at you, not knowing whether you're a friend or a foe.
Yeah. Well, how close were you, or did you see like active combat? How close were you to active combat being shot at?
We didn't see a lot, only because we got there, and then there were still some remnants of it, but it was always, where the mission of the aircraft obviously wasn't to be, in the middle of the combat. For us, it was to be able to figure out where it was so that we could support anyone that did have to go into that area. So, we had specific areas that you would be, assigned to sort of be at the ready in case you needed someone to be able to turn. And, in our aspect, just like we talked about earlier, it's, turning on the jammer so you can disrupt what's going on the ground. So if they need to go someplace that the missile doesn't hit them as they're trying to strike the target.
So in the event that you guys did have someone either locking onto you or coming at you, did the Prowler have countermeasures, or you guys were pretty much trained to just evading and get back to the aircraft carrier?
We had two aspects of it. One was either we flew with an escort, which was always helpful. So you had either, usually there were F-18s at the time, and funny aspect of our deployment to Italy was it was right after we had just been at Las Vegas doing at Nellis doing a purple flag event, which was international, basically international event, and there were a bunch of Spanish pilots and squadrons there with F-18 squadrons. And sure enough, we see them, here we are 3, little offices down or whatever, little pre-makeshift down the side of the runway. It's like, hey, there they are. So it's like same guys we had just seen, a little while ago are out there with us to help us run, which helped, obviously, if you've seen each other before, you understand what's happening and where you want them to be or what it is. But in general, no, Prowlers were very much, if there were bad people in the area, you turned around and went the other direction for the most part. So sent the fighters towards them and we went the other direction. So, and the real reason is just there's, even if you look like you're going to do something, you're not going to be able to do anything.
You can posture.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's just it's a bad situation, hoping to get us getting much better. About as good as you have is when they don't know who you are, right? And once they figure out you can't shoot at them, then it becomes a whole lot worse.
That's true.
Yeah.
Were you in still when 9/11 happened?
I was on my way out. So the way the military works is you need to give, when you're leaving the military, you need to give them between 6 months and a year notice that you're planning to resign. And I had done that, and 9/11 happened, and I was supposed to transition out in October. So it was within 30 days, 35 days of when I was supposed to depart.
Did that change your feelings about leaving at all?
It did a little bit. There was definitely a time when it was, would have been interesting. The part of the reason that I had left, I just made the decision to leave earlier was, number one, the bureaucracy of the military is stifling, in most cases, for the most part, especially at that time. They were still from the, Cold War mentality of what they had to do or didn't have to do, utilization and things that they were asking people to do or not do was, in my mind, surprising for what, they hadn't really modernized a whole lot as they were going through, which was fine. It worked them, served a purpose for whatever it happened to be. But, for me and what I wanted to achieve, it just didn't fit my lifestyle at the time and what I wanted to do with my life going forward. You were separated from your family a lot. There were lots of people who managed to have a family while they were in the military. My wife was not one of those people that wanted to do that. She wanted to say, you are supposed to be as much a part of this family as I am, and I don't want it to be anything less than that. So, that was an important aspect for us when it was. So, And then the third part was, you mentioned being aboard a ship and trying to find something you like to do. So it was a period of time in the military where, because the late 90s was such a high point for the economy, the Navy couldn't keep pilots in the military. They were, number one, they were having a hard time, for lots of reasons, where there wasn't enough flying for them to do while they were in the military. They had this great experience, and the airlines were hiring. And so most of the, the way the military and the Navy in general worked was, fighter pilots and fixed wing jet pilots would usually spend their time on a ship and then go to shore for a little while and then come back to the ship and either be instructors or do something else of that nature. Patrol, P3s, E-6s, other aircraft like that, where you have larger airframes, but they need to be able to be if they want to, grow in their career and get to a captain or an admiral status, they have to have experience of what a carrier battle group operates like. If you're in a patrol squadron, you don't have a lot of that. So they would usually bring them in to say, here, we're going to give you a job on the ship as a shooter to catapult officer, those types of things. So you understand what, how to run, and what a carrier does and how these things work. Because the airlines were hiring, all these people were leaving and going to the airlines. And so there was very much a lack of those types of people. So the way the Navy was putting it forward was every pilot, no matter where they were, and every aviator was going back to the ship for a disassociated sea tour. So those of us who had already been on the ship understood what it was like to be flying on the ship, and then now we're going to be sent to the ship, not allowed to fly and get to do the other thing. So it was one of those aspects of, when you think about what I was telling you earlier, there's some things that are really exciting about being on a ship, and there's a lot of things that aren't so exciting about being on a ship.
Yeah. So you're ready to move on at that point.
And it was, when you think about it, just from a safety perspective, wandering around on an aircraft, they used to say it, I don't know if it's still the case, but it's the most dangerous place in the world to work is on one of those crab boats in Alaska in the wintertime, right? Second most dangerous place to work is on an aircraft carrier, to flight deck, right? So, it's not a safe environment to begin with. Having been in the aircraft and watched people move around and, at night and thinking they're doing the right thing and not necessarily understanding that, when I run up against something on the flight deck and the plane doesn't move, what do? I have to move the throttle a little bit to get the plane over this. Well, whatever is behind you is going to get a little bit more blown around than they were before, right? And, sometimes it's not unknown, but it's sometimes not appreciated, I guess, enough by the pilots, and they'll recognize what they're doing at the time as they're trying to get over this. The guy taxied me over the, over the wire or on the, if you're on one of the, donuts that goes around the wire that's here, it's a little harder to taxi over. So it's like just these things, the plane just gets stuck. You're supposed to ask, the tower and say, hey, I'm stuck, can't move. I got to bring the power up. Can you make sure there's no one behind me so I don't blow anything or any person overboard? But people sometimes forget, and whatever it happens to be, and then all of a sudden,
accidents happen.
Every so often, you get the call from the boss going, "What are you doing? You're blowing all my stuff off the side of the ship." So, yeah, so little things like that. It's always so. It was one of those like I really don't want to be that guy that gets blown off the ship.
Yeah,
my guy gets blown off the ship because some idiot in a Hornet was deciding he wanted to. He didn't want to tell the boss he was, he got stuck, or whatever it happened to be. So, whatever. But it's always an interesting, it's funny watching the airplanes go around, and we were on the carrier deck at one point in time, and we were in a big old turn, and we were, it just happened to be everything worked out the same way, and we're headed towards the edge of the ship, and the ship is making a big turn in the whatever direction it was. So it was like all the momentum was going in that direction. And so, pilot hit the brakes and the airplane just kept on skidding down the side of the airplane towards the, and the edge of the deck is right there. And so there's all these procedures you put out when you're supposed to do, when you think you've lost brakes. And so you turn everything on the carrier is dark. So all of a sudden all the lights go on and everything else, and, which all of a sudden signals that, holy crap, there's some problem. So guys start throwing whatever they can in front of the airplane wheels so they don't go anywhere, right? So you don't slide off the edge of the ship or whatever else. And so, then it was a big, long conversation with the boss. He's like, well, I think we were in a pretty big turn at the same time. We were heading in that direction. Our bad. See if you can, we think it's okay. See if you think it's all right before we send you out. it turned out to be fine. It was just, it was wet and it was all these things put together. So scared the crap out of all of us in the airplane, but
I can't even imagine. Like, you have to think about all these extra things you wouldn't if you were just on land. I mean, there's a lot to consider. Like you just said, the aircraft could literally just if you don't have the brakes on, it's just going to go right off the edge.
And it's, and these airplanes are a little different than, commercial aircraft where the landing gear is either right where you are or a little bit in front of you sometimes for the most part. Most of these airplanes, the landing gear is behind you. So you're looking over the side of the ship as this guy, even when it's daylight is the disconcerting part is here you are taxiing toward the side of the ship and all you see is water. There's a nice big curb, for the lack of a better term, something metal piece on the edge of the flight deck to keep you from falling off. But that's all there is. When you think about it at the end of the day, and you're hoping this guy turns you in the right time and says, you're looking at it going, I sure hope he's turning us soon, because it looks like we're going to fall off the airplane, the side of the deck here, right? So, and then the same thing when you catch the last wire on the ship. You're going forward, and you can't see, like, your perspective. It's like in a car for the most part, just a little more magnified, but you can't see forward. All you see is water in front of you, and you're like, I hope we're stopping. Okay, we're here. Good, we're here.
Yeah, it's like riding with a bad driver.
Yeah, it is.
You're in the car with someone who's driving recklessly. You're just like,
and it was, I make light of this sometimes, but it's, it was a whole lot nicer having four guys in the airplane with you, because at least there was, the common aspect of you all saw the same thing or heard the same thing or whatever it happened to be, as opposed to you're all alone. And the guys, a lot of the Hornet guys. There's a funny story we had one night. We were coming back. We were just getting ready to go. They were doing the recovery for the flight group before. And we're sitting in the airplane and we're watching this guy come in, and he lands, Hornet. It was a crappy weather night. And he comes in, he lands, and the engines are going, and it's like he's there and the engines are still going and they're still going. And then everyone's looking around like, is that what's going on? And then finally boss gets on the airplane. He goes, it's like, it's all right, 222. We got you. You can throttle back. And all you could think of this guy inside the airplane go, okay, I'm here. Everything's all right. I'm back on ship. But, it's that kind of emotion when you're sitting there thinking about it. It's like, it's not your average day in the park. There's rough landings I've done since I've left the Navy and flown, in little airplanes when you come in and it's bad weather and you're hoping, but it has never once been anywhere near what it was like on the carrier. Like, it's just, you get out front of the clouds, you're like, hey, look at that. And even if you're still going down the edge of the runway, you're going fairly fast, it's getting towards the edge. It's like, okay, I'm slowing down. But the realization is, if end of the day, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? I roll off the runway, it's going to damage the airplane. That's not a good thing. Not what I want to have happen, but you're not going into the water. It's just sort of totally different aspect of risk and life and everything else along the way.
So, post-military, where did you pick up with a career? Where, like, I know you said you started with the insurance group, but after that, I guess, I know you've had a number of leadership positions in different companies. Like, where did this business mindset come from? Where did where did that stem from?
So, the military is big on understanding your team and the mission you have to accomplish. And if you think about carrying that into, the business world, it's very similar. So every organization has different groups that have different functions to accomplish different tasks, whatever it happens to be. Breaking down those things into reasonable, actionable items is really the important aspect for most people. So, currently I work in manufacturing. I have for the last 8 or 9 years. And it's that type of mentality to make sure it's people doing what they all need to do in order to achieve the common goal. The question is, what's that common goal? What is it we all want to achieve, and how do we get there? There's a lot of things that happen specifically in manufacturing where people are doing great things. They're doing what has to happen, but it may not necessarily everybody be coordinated to get to the same goal that we all want at the same time. The military was very good at saying, this is what we're doing today, this is what we're doing tomorrow, this is what we're doing the next day. And then even the mission that we're doing today is, here's what you're doing right now. Here's what you're doing in 3 hours. Here's what you're doing 3 hours after that. And that rigor of schedule and being able to get people focused on what needed to happen was very beneficial, because you got stuff done in the right period of time. You get out in the business world and there's a whole lot of other things happening, and people forget that what is it they're supposed to accomplish. So a lot of the aspects we've been able to bring and sort of put together is, how do you organize these groups of people so that they understand that you need to do this, and this is the most important thing that's happening today. So therefore we have to figure out how we get that done, because a lot of times things don't happen for whatever reason. Machine doesn't have, I don't have parts. I don't have enough people. I need a quality inspector to come by and certify this. I need an engineer to sign off on the process. There's all sorts of other things that happen along the way, but understanding, so long as you can get the organization to recognize this is the goal for today, and if somebody in that little group that has to accomplish this calls you and says, I need your help, it means you need to drop everything else and you go do that right away. Very common in the military to have that happen. People just, it's like a second nature type of thing, whereas everyone else is like, well, I'm busy doing this, or I'm busy doing something else, or whatever it happens to be. And similar aspects of the organizations aren't necessarily aligned in such a way where all those assets or resources I need to get this task done are available when I need to get the task done, which usually leads to waiting, schedules miss and whatever it happens to be, and those types of things along the way. And, one of the aspects that, enables a real organization or a good performing organization to do that is that whole scheduling aspect. So critical in a lot of different things, is being able to say, if you think about, any large, assembly operation, the automobile manufacturing is a great example of it, but, smaller, not quite as high volume. You get, airplanes, for instance, when Boeing has a, commercial assembly line, and you're watching things roll down the line and things have to go on in a certain order. There's a reason they need to go on in a certain order, and the same thing with a ship. When you're building a ship, I need this part to be here at this point in time. Why? Because I'm putting a deck above it, below it, and on the side. So it's not going to fit once I put these things on. So your part needs to be here before that happens. Very important aspect of what happens. So making sure that they can put all these things together is really critical. And I think it's starting to get a lot of more traction, because people start to recognize that, because there's two aspects of it. And we refer to this all the time in the business world, which is, you sign a contract with your customer, and your customer really doesn't care how much it costs you to make whatever it is you said you agreed to make. They don't care. I mean, they do conceptually, because they'd like you to continue as a partner and they want to make sure it works out, but it really doesn't matter to them. What they care about is that you give them the right part at the right time, and it's on schedule, right? Because that's what's important to them, because it's what helps drive their business. So balancing those two aspects as a supplier to, or whatever it happens to be, is, even if you're the shipbuilder trying to deliver it to the government customer or a commercial customer, at the end of the day, the answer is, I promised you on a certain date. How do I make sure I get it there? Being able to bring those things back into the right time frame is hugely important, for the military in particular, because they're planning on long range schedules as well, right? So if I want to make sure a carrier is available to be commissioned and at sea and functional on a certain date, because I want to decommission another carrier it's in need of lots of extra maintenance, if this doesn't happen, that's a big deal. That's an important decision that has to happen. And there's different aspects to it and along the way, but it's usually one of those things that, how do you drive that type of, when you think about the military and their ability to channel everyone's focus into certain specific areas, it's the motivating aspect of it is usually the big one. So, finding people who can, one of my favorite quotes on leadership was from Dwight Eisenhower, where he said, leadership is getting other people to do what you want done because they want to do it. Yeah. It's like, simple concept, but at the end of the day, the answer is, I'm not telling you, I know what I want to do. You've got other ideas of what you want to do today, but we need to make sure we're both on the same page on this.
We've run into that ourselves with our beverage company. Like, as founders, no one's going to care about the mission as much as us, but our job with anyone we bring on is to find a way to get them to want the same thing as much as we do, or as close to it as possible. And I think anyone with employees would recognize that. It's like, no employee, no amount of money is going to make them care about what you want done as much as you do. So you got to find ways to make that happen without money.
Right. And taking care of your people is such a big aspect of what happens. And, people forget, sometimes people that in a lot of the time I can tell people who good officers in the Navy or good high senior enlisted people in the Navy recognize the same thing, which is how did you the reason your people did things forward is because they respected you and they thought you were there to look out for them as much as you were for them. And, one of the things I notice, and I try to tell my kids, and notice, make sure you find examples of this is, look at how dedicated they all are to each other. When my daughter plays basketball and trying to get them all motivated to say, we're all trying to do the same thing today. This is our goal and how do we get there? Yeah, we all like to win a game. It's like, okay, well, what are the things we have to do in order to get there? What is it that I have to do today to help you succeed? And same thing with you to help me succeed so we can all be on the same thing and the team succeeds, right? And it's those little bits of everything along the way. It's like, what I find is interesting is you get, my kid, because the kids ask the question, why is there so much difference between what the NCAA does and what pro basketball does? I'm like, because one group cares about it a whole lot more than the other one does. One group's, but they're out there sometimes, not all of them, but some of them, they're on their own schedule doing whatever it is they want to do for whatever reason they're doing it. And it may or may not align to the needs of the team and the organization, which good, bad, or otherwise, sometimes it's that's where you see the difference between really great teams and the ones that aren't so great.
So I'm hearing some of the biggest takeaways from the military were like organizational prioritization of tasks and schedule, operational efficiency. It seems like that has really helped you now in your business career. What are some of the highlights? Just I know you've held a number of positions, but what are some of the highlights of your business career? Like things you're most proud of that you've done post-military?
A lot of it focuses around how, trying to take an organization that wasn't working very well and turn it into one that does. Right. I mean, there's a lot of, there's stories about that replete the military too. There's, great, I cannot remember the name of the guy. He's fantastic. Basically took the worst performing submarine there was in the whole Navy and turned it into the absolute best. And it was all based on, how do you treat people and how do you motivate a team and how do you make them all recognize that what they're doing is important, even though you may not think that, chipping paint and scrubbing urinals is important. It's all important in order to get things to the end and the final and the finish goal. But it's that aspect of being able to get people motivated and be excited about what it is they're here for. So, showing up on a daily basis at work sometimes is boring and you're not happy about it. And there's lots of other things, especially when you're not in the military, all the other aspects of life that get in the way, that are there, that influence you in some way, shape, or form. How do you as an organization understand all those things and get these people to the point where they recognize that, number one, you care, even though they may not know what it is, they care about you and they want to make sure that you are able to take care of those things that make you better when you come to work, right? So, little things that make it work that way. Holding people accountable, setting things out, very specific tasks so they can feel like they're successful on a daily basis. Little things that help people recognize that even though my job can be sometimes a little, concerning and there's so much and I can't do it all. It's like breaking each task down to small, measurable little things that you can say, I accomplished this today. I got this done. I got this. And it's all part of the process, helps people be, who aren't necessarily always the best at looking at big picture are able to understand how that works.
Love it. If you could give one piece of advice to people who are exiting the military, either have or will be soon, trying to make that transition into civilian life, potentially the business world. If you give a piece of advice to them, what would that be?
Be confident in what you've done and understand that, a lot of the things you do on a regular basis, even though you don't think about it all the time, are very much needed in everyday life. They're everyday life skills that you've learned and perfected over time. And a lot of the time you do them better than most others who haven't had to worry about them so much. In a lot of aspects, we talk about, what's important and figuring out what's important and concentrating on those things that are important and not getting worried about the things that aren't important that you can't control. Yeah. The military is one of those things where there are so many things that are beyond your control that you just have to accept the fact it's going to happen. You're going to get deployed in 2 weeks. Great. Do I have any control over that? No. So it doesn't matter how unhappy you get over that situation. You can't change that fact.
I was going to say, yeah, we talked earlier beforehand about how perspective is so important in this day and age, and how just people who have not had that military background, don't seem to understand what you've been through and what you've seen and done, and how it really puts everything in perspective of like, is you said, is someone going to die today? And like, if the answer is no, then things are probably going to be okay.
We can well work with that. At the end of the day, the answer is, though it may seem challenging, and yes, it's going to be situations you have to get through, and sometimes you want to panic and throw your, run around and, your hair's on fire and all you want to do. But at the end of the day, you're right. If you stop, take a deep breath, think about what's going to happen next, get through what has to happen. So, we would run through, things go wrong in an airplane. You start running through emergency procedures to make sure that, you don't end up, without an engine or without an airplane, or having to ride in the silk harness on the way down. It's an important aspect of making sure you can, just run through what has to happen on a regular basis and, take a deep breath, relax, figure out what you need to do, and move forward.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and we're just honored to have been able to sit here and talk with you. Thank you for your service, and just excited to get this one out to everyone. So thank you again for coming on the show.
It's great to be here. You're very welcome. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.